So, where we left off last week, Spain has regained control of Fernandina Beach and Amelia Island. U.S. troops have stood down and have returned to Georgia. And they're engaged in a war against Britain at this time and officially declared war. So they're focused on that. But
in January of 1814, there's another group of volunteers that starts raiding Seminole camps and creating considerable disturbances, really kind of in the neighborhood of Paynes Prairie, what is now Gainesville, the University of Florida, that area. President Madison officially refused to recognize the Republic of East Florida, which was devastating to the Patriots because they thought it would go the way it eventually went in Texas 2 decades later, which is Texas becomes an independent country and then eventually gets absorbed as a U.S. territory or U.S. state. Of course, the election of 1844 was fought on the annexation of Texas between Henry Clay, who I mentioned earlier, who by that time was the leader of the Whig Party and was, very moderate, and James Polk, who was a firebrand and won that election, the Democrat, very conservative, very expansionist, maybe the imperialist, if you will, manifest destiny. Anyway, that's 1844. We're talking about 1814 now. So Madison refuses to recognize this Republic of East Florida, and the leader of this group of patriots is a guy named General Buckner Harris from Georgia. Spanish authorities, who are still nominally in control of Florida but can't really do anything on their own, tell the Seminoles, hey, here's a bounty, get this Harris guy. And sure enough, it didn't take the Seminoles very long. I think it took them 2 weeks. In May of 1814, they ambushed, killed, and scalped Harris. His murder left the Patriots leaderless, and the Republic of East Florida was terminated effectively at that point, so Spain hangs on to the territory. While all of this is going on, the United States is at war with Great Britain. The war isn't going particularly well for much of it. Washington was burned. Baltimore was almost captured. I think obviously that was the big turning point of the war, was when the United States did not lose control of Baltimore and General Robert Ross was killed. But 1812 and 1813, the U.S. invasions of Canada had been rebuffed. In fact, if you talk to a lot of Canadians, they view this as the War of 1812 as their war of independence. It's a huge deal in Canadian history, even if it's a largely forgotten war in American history, maybe a little bit of an embarrassment that the United States was so boastful and prideful that they stumbled into a war with Great Britain and were keeping their head a little bit above water until British regulars showed up after Napoleon was defeated for the first time when he abdicated to Elba. But like so much in American history, so many wars, there was a Florida element to it. We've talked about Queen Anne's War. We've talked about the War of Jenkins' Ear. In fact, the War of Jenkins' Ear, the North American theater, and the same thing with Queen Anne's War, was largely fought in and around Florida. The Revolutionary War, there were a number of battles in the state of Florida, and a lot of things that involve Florida in that revolution that often are forgotten or not taught in American history. And there was this element of the War of 1812, which was a connected conflict to a certain extent. Now, of course, in American history, it is taught pretty extensively the controversy over the Spanish province of West Florida, which was everything west of the Swanee River, from the Swanee River to the Mississippi River until 1810, including the Florida parishes of Louisiana, what are now known as the Florida parishes of Louisiana, from Baton Rouge all the way to the state border, and then southern Mississippi, southern Alabama, Pensacola, all the way through the Big Bend region, the old Appalachia district, which was the district centered around what is now Tallahassee in North Florida. That had been the province of Appalachia, prosperous province during Spanish rule in the 1600s. Everybody got wiped out or hauled away to Charleston as slaves in 1704 when Carolina Governor James Moore sacked the area, destroyed the province, sent Florida into a horrible era in the 1700s. In fact, We've talked about this on previous podcasts. Florida very prosperous in the 1600s under Spanish rule, really destroyed in Queen Anne's War. But West Florida was a big deal in American history, or is taught as a big deal. The Battle of Pensacola in 1814 is taught as part of American history, but there was a whole theater of the war, or a connected conflict that took place in East Florida that's not often talked about. So hopefully you enjoyed the show today. We talked about something completely different, something that's not talked about very much.
Now, the action in East Florida wasn't done at this point. On January 10th, 1815, Admiral George Cockburn and 1,500 British troops landed on Cumberland Island, just north of the Florida-Georgia border. That's just north of, if you've been to Fort Clinch in Fernandina Beach, you can look out over Cumberland Sound. Cumberland Island is just to the north. The fort had been, of course, a staging ground. That area had been a staging ground for the Patriot invasion of Florida 3 years prior. Now, Admiral Cockburn is a guy who is considered a villain in American history because he burned the Capitol. He burned the White House. He ordered the burning of the White House. But he was also a rabid abolitionist, by the way. So, maybe the view of him will change in history as our norms change and our attitudes change about certain topics. So, the British occupied the town of St. Mary's within days. St. Mary's, Georgia being the town that's just north of the Florida-Georgia border. Still a historic town. It's a town actually where Aaron Burr hid out after he had killed Alexander Hamilton in a duel. While the British ended occupation of St. Mary's after a week, the British ships continued to control Cumberland Sound until March. In this period, the British facilitated the freedom of close to 2,000 slaves, many of which came from East Florida plantations, nominally under Spanish rule, or had run away and hid in the Florida hinterland. Runaway slaves from South Carolina and Georgia that had hid among the Seminole or in the swamps in the wilderness in Florida. And as I just said, it's a historic irony that Cockburn, who's portrayed as a villain in most U.S. history textbooks for a central role in the burning of Washington, D.C., and he is the man who ordered the burning, there's no two ways about that, is not seen widely as the great emancipator that he actually was. Hey, maybe that tells us why certain themes are explored in American history and why American history was written the way it was in the past about certain individuals. So, Admiral George Cockburn, maybe this changes your mind a little bit about him. I still don't like that he burnt the Capitol, obviously, but obviously he had some virtuous sides to him. Anyway, we'll be back next week, and I think next week we'll probably pick up with what's going on in West Florida and the full-on Jeffersonian takeover of Florida, the Jeffersonian conquest of Florida.